December 1944. A forward aid station near Malmedy, Belgium. The frozen mud crackles under the heavy boots of an American military police patrol as they move through a dense, fog-choked forest. The morning air carries the sharp scent of pine and pinewood smoke. But everything changes when the lead jeep grinds to a sudden halt near an isolated crossroads. In a shallow, snow-dusted ditch, 4 American soldiers lie perfectly still, stripped entirely naked in the freezing wind. Their dog tags are missing, their olive-drab uniforms are gone, and their combat boots have been torn from their feet. These men did not die from artillery shrapnel or distant rifle fire. They were murdered at close range with single pistol shots to the back of the head. General George S. Patton would soon uncover a twisted web of identity theft that challenged the rules of civilized warfare. This is the story of what happened when German saboteurs stole American identities during the Battle of the Bulge, and how General Patton met them with absolute, unforgiving justice. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what soldiers found that changed them forever. Sergeant Patrick Doyle was 27 years old, hailed from the tough neighborhoods of Boston, Massachusetts, and served as a military police investigator with the Third Army. Before the war, he worked as a street patrolman, a job that taught him how to read human behavior and spot a lie in the dark. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a young wife and a baby daughter he had only held once. Doyle had tracked thieves, deserters, and black market racketeers from the beaches of Normandy all the way to the forests of the Ardennes, losing his best friend to an artillery barrage outside Metz. That loss left him hardened, keen-eyed, and completely ruthless when it came to protecting the men on the front lines. He was the investigator called to the freezing crossroads near Malmedy to look at the 4 stripped bodies, and his cop instincts immediately told him that this was no ordinary German ambush. Oberleutnant Kurt Moeller was 28 years old, came from a wealthy family in Berlin, and commanded a specialized commando cell within Operation Greif. He was a fanatical believer in the total victory of the Reich, convinced that conventional military rules were built for weak nations and that deception was the ultimate weapon of a superior race. Moeller spoke fluent, unaccented American English, a skill he had perfected before the war by watching hundreds of Hollywood movies and studying American slang. His unearned privilege showed in his perfectly tailored wool coat, his polished boots, and the gold signet ring he wore on his left hand. He had personally executed 6 isolated American soldiers, stripping their bodies while they were still warm, and he carried their stolen dog tags in his pocket as operational props. He used these names to masquerade as an American officer, moving freely behind the lines to cut telephone wires and flip road signs to misdirect entire convoys into deadly traps. By the middle of December 1944, the European theater had reached a critical, bleeding bottleneck. The Allied advance had slowed to a grueling crawl against the German border, and the frozen expanse of the Ardennes forest was supposed to be a quiet sector for weary divisions to rest. Instead, Adolf Hitler unleashed a massive, desperate counteroffensive that caught the Allied high command completely off guard. The German war machine was fracturing, running out of fuel, and facing total collapse from both the east and the west. In this atmosphere of supreme desperation, conventional tactics were cast aside by the high command in Berlin. They realized that standard frontal assaults could no longer smash the American machine, so they turned to sabotage, infiltration, and psychological chaos to break the line. Operation Greif was the brainchild of Germany's most dangerous commando leaders, a plan specifically designed to exploit the vast, disorganized nature of the American rear echelons. Thousands of troops were retreating, reinforcing, and shifting positions in the blinding snow, making it incredibly easy for a small, bilingual group of saboteurs to slip through the gaps. In previous months, other senior Allied officers had frequently dismissed reports of strange jeep drivers or altered road markers as simple backwoods confusion or standard frontline panic. They let the small discrepancies slide, chalking it up to the friction of war and the greenness of newly arrived replacement troops. This official negligence allowed the infiltration cells to deepen their reach, spreading a paralyzing paranoia through every junction. The entire American army was beginning to look at itself with deep suspicion, wondering if the man standing at the next checkpoint was a brother or a ghost. That wave of unchecked fear came to a sudden, screeching halt at a tiny supply depot outside Spa. An American military police captain stood by a wooden barricade at the perimeter of the supply depot, his gloved hand resting on the holster of his service pistol. He watched an American Jeep approach from the swirling snow, its headlights dimmed by canvas covers. The vehicle carried 3 men wearing standard olive-drab winter coats and muddy combat boots. The driver cut the engine, and an American first lieutenant climbed out of the passenger seat, his uniform crisp and his manner completely relaxed. The captain stepped forward, checking his clipboard, and asked the man for his unit designation and routing orders. The lieutenant smiled smoothly and replied in perfect, unaccented English that they were from the 1st Infantry Division, carrying urgent courier messages to the rear headquarters. He explained that they had taken a wrong turn near the crossroads due to a mismarked sign and simply needed to pass through the depot to get back on the main highway. The captain looked at the man's pristine gear, noting the lack of mud on his coat despite the brutal conditions of the Ardennes front. He asked the lieutenant who won the World Series the previous year, a standard screening question used by rear guard units. The lieutenant laughed, shook his head, and said he did not follow baseball because he was from a small town in Vermont where everyone preferred winter sports. He then demanded that the captain move the barricade immediately, stating that delayed intelligence could cost American lives on the front line. The captain remained still, his face completely blank under his steel helmet, and asked the lieutenant to name the capital of Illinois. The lieutenant frowned, his posture stiffening, and snapped that he did not have time for schoolboy geography lessons from a low-ranking checkpoint guard. He declared that his authority came directly from Corps headquarters, and that blocking an officer during a major enemy offensive was a court-martial offense. The captain looked past the man's shoulder into the Jeep, where the 2 passengers sat perfectly rigid, their hands buried deep in their pockets. He noticed that the lieutenant was wearing a pair of polished leather boots that did not match the standard issue footwear of the infantry. The captain raised his flashlight, shining the beam directly onto the lieutenant's chest, and asked one final question about the location of a specific bridge. The lieutenant became defensive, stepping closer to the captain, and stated that superior soldiers did not answer to bureaucratic gatekeepers who were too frightened to fight on the line. He said that the Germanic spirit of efficiency would always overcome the lazy, disorganized procedures of the American rear guard. The captain instantly recognized the slip in the man's rhetoric, stepped back, and whistled sharply to the guards waiting in the wooden shack. 6 military policemen emerged with shotguns leveled, surrounding the Jeep before the driver could restart the engine. The 3 men were forced out of the vehicle at gunpoint, their pockets searched, revealing 4 sets of blood-stained American dog tags and German military identification papers. The captain realized this was the Operation Greif cell that had been murdering isolated patrols, and he ordered them locked in the secure holding cell. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's Jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The heavy vehicle skidded slightly on the hard-packed ice before coming to a complete stop outside the brick guardhouse. The general walked in unannounced, his wool coat buttoned tight against the bitter wind, his eyes fixing instantly on the 3 prisoners sitting on a wooden bench under armed guard. The room became perfectly silent as every military policeman stood at rigid attention. Patton studied him, his gaze locking directly onto the leader of the infiltration cell, whose stolen wool uniform was still immaculate. Patton's voice was quiet, but it carried across the small room with freezing clarity. He asked how the lieutenant had enjoyed his journey through the American lines. Mueller looked up, maintaining his calm composure, and stated that his journey had been highly successful until a minor clerical misunderstanding at the outer gate stopped his vehicle. Patton then asked the man, whose name was stamped onto the steel dog tags currently resting on the guard's table. Moeller replied that the name belonged to an American soldier who no longer required his earthly identity. Choosing to speak with a relaxed, cold indifference, Patton asked if the 4 men found dead in the ditch near the Malmedy crossroads had also volunteered to surrender their clothing for the glory of the Reich. Moeller shrugged his shoulders slightly, stating that in total war, utility always dictates action, and an empty uniform was simply a wasted resource on a freezing battlefield. Patton walked closer, stopping exactly 2 feet from the seated German officer, his face completely rigid. He told the commander that a true soldier identifies himself by the colors he carries openly into the fight. He said that a man who strips the dead to hide his own skin has discarded his status as a combatant and chosen the path of a thief. He contrasted the stolen name on the dog tags with the reality of the American soldiers who had earned those identities through honorable service on the front lines. He noted that the men who died in the ditch would have their records preserved, while the men who murdered them would leave nothing behind but an unmarked grave. He told Moeller that he had exactly 2 options left to face before the sun went down behind the pine trees. He could reveal the exact locations of the remaining Greif cells operating within the sector, or he could stand against the brick wall of the supply yard under the immediate penalty prescribed for espionage. He told the commander to make his choice in the next 10 seconds, because the Third Army did not waste rations on spies who wore the clothing of murdered Americans. Moeller remained silent, his jaw tightening as he refused to speak another word. The heavy wooden door of the supply yard swung open, exposing the 3 captured infiltrators to the biting, sub-zero wind of the Belgian winter. A firing squad consisting of 12 military policemen from the Third Army stood formed in a precise line, their winter coats dusted with fresh snow and their standard-issue M1 Garand rifles held firmly at the ready. Oberleutnant Kurt Moeller was marched out first, his chin held high in a final show of defiant arrogance, but his boots slipped heavily on the slick patches of black ice coating the cobblestones. The guards stripped away the stolen American wool jackets, forcing the 3 saboteurs to stand in their thin undergarments against the freezing, blood-stained brick wall. The sharp, metallic clatter of 12 rifle bolts locking into position echoed loudly off the surrounding stone buildings, cutting through the low howl of the wind. A small crowd of grease-stained mechanics, weary truck drivers, and frontline infantrymen gathered along the perimeter of the yard, watching the proceedings in total, grim silence. Doyle stood directly behind the firing squad, his eyes fixed on the man who had tried to steal his country's identity. The commanding officer raised his black-gloved hand, paused for one agonizing heartbeat, and brought it down sharply to signal the execution. Sergeant Patrick Doyle returned to Boston after the guns fell silent, carrying a quiet trauma that the celebratory parades could never wash away. He went back to his old beat on the city streets, but his eyes always lingered just a second longer on the faces of strangers, searching for the microscopic tells of deception he had mastered in the snow of the Ardennes. He lived a long, quiet life surrounded by his children and grandchildren, never watching Hollywood war movies, and rarely speaking about the winter of 1944. He passed away in his family home in 1982, keeping a small, locked metal box in his bureau that contained nothing but his old investigator badge and a single piece of frozen charcoal. Kurt Moeller never received the glorious burial he had envisioned, while masquerading in his stolen wool coats behind the American lines. His body, along with those of his commando cell, was placed in an unmarked grave in a remote corner of Belgium, wrapped in plain burlap with no military honors or ideological tokens. His wealthy family in Berlin spent years trying to track his final movements through official red tape, but the chaotic nature of military espionage records left his fate an absolute mystery until 1956. By the time his name was verified in a decrypted archive, his childhood home had been demolished, and his cause had been thoroughly scrubbed from the history books. General George S. Patton never mentioned the execution of the identity thieves in his public briefings or his post-war press conferences. He kept the intelligence file concerning Operation Greif locked in the bottom drawer of his field desk until the final day of his command, along with the dental records used to give the 4 murdered patrolmen their names back. In a private letter written to his wife just 3 days before his fatal accident in 1945, he noted that a man who steals another soldier's name steals his honor, and the only proper response is to strike him out of existence entirely. Some historians have argued that the immediate execution of German commandos caught in American uniforms was a brutal violation of conventional military tribunal procedures, pointing out that the rapid pace of the frontline trials left almost no room for legal appeal or diplomatic review. They contend that the chaotic atmosphere of the Battle of the Bulge forced senior commanders to make emotional, retaliatory decisions rather than adhering to the strict letter of international law. Others have argued the opposite, defending the swift actions of the field commanders by stating that the Geneva Convention explicitly denies protection to combatants who conceal their true identity to commit acts of sabotage behind enemy lines. What is certain is that the absolute finality of Patton's orders sent a chilling wave of terror through the infiltration units, completely neutralizing the operational effectiveness of Operation Greif before the German counteroffensive could shatter the Allied line. If you had been in General Patton's position during the frozen crisis of the Ardennes, would you have ordered the immediate execution of those identity thieves? Or would you have delayed the verdict for a formal military tribunal after the counteroffensive was broken? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you want more deeply investigated historical accounts about what soldiers found that changed them forever, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now.